the forest didn't welcome strangers. The trees bent close, whispering against one another like gossiping elders guarding a long-kept secret. Fog coiled low through the hollows, clinging to the earth as if afraid of what lingered above it. By the time the journalist's truck reached the edge of Hollow Creek, daylight had thinned to a sickly gray, and every mile of the dirt road seemed to pulse with something alive, unseen, and waiting. Locals had called it superstition, a cruel story passed between drunks and old women to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But the whispers were consistent, each spoke of a family that stayed too long in isolation, loving only their own, until their blood grew tired and twisted. They said the curse showed itself first in the eyes, babies born with lids sealed shut, skin smooth where sight should have been. The women never screamed when born, they only breathed quietly, as though they already knew what they weren't meant to see. The journalist had come for truth, but the town offered only silence. Doors closed at the mention of Hollow Creek. Faces turned away, and the same warning echoed again and again, some families weren't meant to outlive their sins. Still, curiosity outweighed caution. That night, under a pale, reluctant moon, he parked at the forest's edge, recorder in hand, his breath visible in the cold. Somewhere beyond the trees, a faint, rhythmic tapping answered him, slow, deliberate, and too human to be the wind. The journalist's arrival in the remote Appalachian Valley was not born out of coincidence but of obsession. Months of fragmented whispers, half-buried reports, and blurred photographs had led him here, to a place the world seemed to have forgotten. The road that wound into the valley was narrow and broken, hemmed in by trees that seemed older than time itself. Every turn of the wheel carried the weight of stories told in hushed tones, of families that never left and bloodlines that refused to die out. He came chasing a legend that most people dismissed as a cruel fable, a tale of a lineage so corrupted by inbreeding that its children were born without eyes, their faces smooth and unformed, as though nature itself had turned away in disgust. To him, this was more than a story, it was a truth buried beneath generations of denial and fear. He had spent years chasing the grotesque corners of forgotten America, cataloging its secrets and unraveling its myths. But something about this case had clung to him differently. The phrase that haunted his notebook, the blood that bred the light away, wasn't something easily dismissed as folklore. It carried the rhythm of something ancient, something that lived longer than reason. As he entered the valley, he felt it immediately, a quiet heaviness that pressed on the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The locals had warned him through silence. Every inquiry met with uneasy glances, every question deflected by a shrug or a mumbled prayer. He noticed how the people here avoided the woods, how they hurried home before the sun began to fall behind the ridge. In the gas station where he stopped for fuel, the old man behind the counter had said only one thing before retreating into the back room, if you're going where I think you're going, you won't find what you're looking for. You'll find what's left. The words lingered with him like a bruise. As he drove deeper, the valley seemed to fold in on itself, swallowing the last traces of civilization. His headlights carved a thin path through the mist, illuminating sagging barns and rusted fences overtaken by weeds. Somewhere in the distance, a creek murmured faintly beneath the hum of insects. The deeper he went, the more he felt watched, not by animals, but by the very ground beneath him. Every sound carried too far, every shadow stretched too long. By the time he reached the clearing where his map ended, night had already fallen. The engine died, and for the first time, he realized how complete the silence was, thick, absolute, and waiting, as though the valley itself had been holding its breath for his arrival. The deeper the journalist ventured into the valley, the more he realized that silence was not just a habit here, it was a law. The townspeople didn't merely avoid speaking about Hollow Creek, they recoiled from its name as though it summoned something that could hear them. Whenever he asked for directions, conversations died mid-sentence. Shopkeepers pretended not to hear. Even the children, who usually found delight in repeating the things adults feared, went still at the mention of that place. The name carried weight, and in that weight, the journalist sensed the pulse of a truth buried beneath generations of secrecy. Hollow Creek was not on any map. The roads that once led there had been deliberately erased, left to crumble under landslides and rot. Trees had reclaimed what was once a narrow passage, as if nature itself was eager to conceal what humanity had done there. He first heard of it through an old newspaper clipping dated nearly 50 years prior, a brief mention of a family tragedy, a fire, and a string of stillbirths in a remote part of Appalachia. Yet, when he tried to trace the details, every record ended abruptly. Birth certificates, land deeds, census entries, all vanished as if the bloodline itself had been erased. When he brought up the story in town, the air would grow colder. One woman at the diner crossed herself and whispered, "That place don't belong to God anymore." Another warned him that people who went looking for Hollow Creek didn't come back the same. He couldn't tell whether it was fear, superstition, or guilt that kept their mouths shut. Each night, as he stayed in the creaky, rented cabin near the edge of the woods, the journalist reviewed his notes by lantern light. The more he pieced together, the clearer it became that Hollow Creek was more than a geographic location, it was an absence. A void where people, history, and light simply ceased to exist. Local folklore spoke of a family that withdrew from the rest of the valley generations ago, refusing outsiders, marrying only within their bloodline, and growing stranger with each passing decade. No one could say when they had last been seen. Some claimed the family had burned in the fire mentioned in the old article. Others whispered that they had never died at all but had simply gone deeper into the woods, where no one dared to follow. By the fourth day, the journalist found himself standing before a faded wooden sign half swallowed by ivy. The words carved into it were barely legible, worn by decades of rain and neglect. But under the moss, he could still make them out. Hollow Creek Road. The moment he read it, the wind shifted. The forest fell silent, and for the first time, he felt the weight of every unspoken warning pressing against his chest, urging him to turn back before the woods remembered his name. The old midwife lived on the outskirts of town in a leaning house swallowed by vines, the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped paying attention. Her name appeared only once in the journalist's research, attached to a faded birth record from nearly 30 years ago, the last known documentation of a child born in Hollow Creek. She was said to be the only one still alive who had seen the family up close, the only witness to what the town had tried to bury in silence. When the journalist knocked on her door, it took several long moments before it creaked open, revealing a woman whose face looked carved from the same wood as her porch. Her eyes were cloudy, but sharp, as if they had learned long ago to see things that others refused to. At first, she refused to speak. She told him Hollow Creek was not a place for the living and that some stories were not meant to be retold. But when he showed her the brittle photograph from the newspaper, a family of 6 standing before a cabin, their faces expressionless, the youngest child's features blurred, something in her changed. Her hands trembled as she traced the image. Then, almost against her will, she began to talk. Her voice cracked like dry bark as she described the night that had never left her mind. She had been called to the cabin on a rain-soaked evening in early spring, years ago. The father had ridden down the mountain to fetch her, his clothes soaked, his eyes wide with panic. The midwife followed him through the storm, up the twisting path to a house that seemed more shadow than structure. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of smoke and something metallic, blood or rot, she couldn't tell which. The mother was already in labor, silent except for the faintest breath between contractions. No one else spoke, not even the 2 older children watching from the corner. When the baby came, the midwife said, the room fell unnaturally still. The child did not cry, did not move. It breathed softly, rhythmically, like something ancient trying to remember how to live. At first, the midwife thought the infant's eyes were simply shut tight, but when she touched its face, she found only smooth, unbroken skin. No lids, no sockets, no trace of what should have been there. The father had turned away, muttering words she didn't understand, while the mother reached out and took the child into her arms, humming a low, tuneless lullaby. The midwife left before dawn, but as she stepped into the rain, she swore she heard the baby whispering, a faint sound, like the forest breathing through hollow wood. She never went back to Hollow Creek again. The discovery of the family Bible came unexpectedly, in a place the journalist hadn't meant to search. After days of wandering through the decaying remains of Hollow Creek, he stumbled upon what had once been a church. Its roof had caved in, and vines climbed through shattered stained glass, spilling into the pews like veins reclaiming a body. Dust and ash blanketed the floor, muffling every step he took. The altar stood crooked, draped in cobwebs, but something about the shadows behind it drew his attention. Beneath a warped plank, half hidden in soil and rot, he found a small wooden chest sealed with rusted hinges. When he pried it open, the stench of mildew and time filled the air, and inside lay a single object wrapped in a piece of rotted cloth, a thick, leather-bound Bible, its cover blackened and soft with age. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. The gilt lettering on the spine had long since faded, and the pages stuck together like skin. But as he opened it, the weight of what he was holding settled in his chest. The first pages were filled with familiar inscriptions, dates of births, baptisms, and deaths written in looping script, but something was deeply wrong. The same 7 names appeared again and again, generation after generation, repeating like an incantation. The surnames never changed. The mothers and fathers were always listed as each other's kin. And with each new entry, the handwriting grew more erratic, the ink darker, thicker, as if the writer had been pressing too hard or writing in the dark. He turned to the final pages, where the words had become nearly illegible. The names blurred together, the dates overlapping in impossible ways. A faint red smear crossed the page, not ink but something darker, something that had seeped into the paper and never dried. In the margin, a trembling hand had written a single phrase, asterisk, the eyes are closed to see the truth. Asterisk, the sentence seemed to pulse on the page, the ink almost fresh in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. He ran his fingers over the letters and felt a strange warmth beneath the paper, as though the book itself had a pulse. When he left the church, the air felt heavier. The forest, silent until then, stirred faintly, the sound of leaves shifting like whispered prayers. Clutching the Bible to his chest, he realized he wasn't holding a record of faith but a confession, a lineage written not for salvation but for remembrance. Every repeated name, every desperate scrawl, was proof that the family hadn't just kept their bloodline alive, they had preserved it, guarded it, as if it were the only thing that gave them meaning. The thought chilled him as he walked back through the woods, because somewhere beyond the trees, he could feel that same blood still watching, still breathing. The first carcass appeared on the second night. The journalist had returned to his cabin, exhausted from combing through the ruins of Hollow Creek, when he noticed something lying near the porch steps, a small animal, maybe a rabbit, its body twisted unnaturally. At first, he thought it had been mauled by a predator, but when he crouched to look closer, the truth struck him like a physical blow. The creature's eyes were gone, not torn or clawed, but cleanly removed, leaving only 2 perfect hollows where sight had once been. He buried it behind the cabin, telling himself it was coincidence, the work of scavengers. But deep down, the unease had already taken root. By the following evening, the air around the woods had changed. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs had fallen silent, replaced by the faint rustle of something moving between the trees. That night, another body appeared, this time a raccoon, placed neatly at his doorstep as though arranged for him to find. Its eyes, too, were missing. He noticed how the blood hadn't stained the ground around it, how the body looked almost drained, emptied. The forest around the cabin seemed to lean closer, the line between natural and unnatural thinning with each breath he took. Sleep became impossible. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of wood, the whisper of wind against glass, the distant trickle of the creek that now felt like a heartbeat pulsing through the soil. The journalist tried to rationalize it, telling himself that the animals were dying from disease, that their injuries were the result of decay. Yet each morning, a new offering awaited him, each one closer to where he slept. A fox. A stray dog. A crow, its wings spread open like a crucifix, its sockets empty. He began locking the doors and windows, though he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there didn't need permission to come inside. His recorder picked up faint sounds at night, soft footsteps circling the cabin, and once, something that almost resembled breathing near the wall behind his bed. The locals had warned him that the woods around Hollow Creek didn't forgive trespassers. Now, he understood they hadn't been speaking metaphorically. The animals weren't just a warning, they were a message, a ritual carried out with purpose. On the 5th night, he found the largest one yet, a deer, its body sprawled beneath his window. Its eyes were gone, but its head was turned toward the cabin, facing him, as though it had seen something in its final moment. That night, for the first time, he closed his curtains, but long after the lamps went dark, he could still feel it, the gaze of something that did not need eyes to see him. The locket was found by accident, buried beneath a layer of damp leaves near the ruins of what once might have been a churchyard. The journalist had been combing the area for remnants of the Hollow Creek family, hoping for something tangible beyond the whispers and old records. The day was gray, and the air hung thick with the scent of decay and rain-soaked earth. When his boot struck something metallic, the sound felt unnaturally sharp in the silence. He knelt down and brushed away the dirt until the faint outline of a heart-shaped pendant emerged, its silver dulled by age and corrosion. The chain was broken, the clasp twisted as if torn from someone's neck in a hurry. He lifted it carefully, the metal cold against his palm, and for a brief moment, a strange unease crawled over him, an instinct that told him he had disturbed something that preferred to remain hidden. Inside, behind a pane of cracked glass, was a small, faded photograph. The image was old, perhaps taken half a century ago. It showed a young woman standing in front of the same wooden cabin he had seen in the blurred newspaper photo, her expression distant, her posture rigid. She looked barely 20, her dress plain but clean, her hair braided neatly down her shoulder. But it wasn't her presence that struck him, it was her absence. Her face, once clear, had been violently defaced. Long, jagged scratches carved across the photo, shredding her features into obscurity. Whoever had done it had pressed hard enough to tear the paper, the anger in those strokes almost palpable. The journalist felt a chill crawl through him. He turned the locket over and noticed faint letters engraved into the back, nearly worn away by time. They spelled a name, Lydia, He searched his notes and realized the name appeared several times in the family Bible, repeated across generations, each time belonging to a daughter who had died young. It wasn't just a coincidence. The woman in the photograph might have been one of them, or perhaps all of them, the repetition of the same name passed down like a curse, erasing individuality until only blood remained. That night, he placed the locket on the table beside his recorder, but its presence seemed to change the room. The air grew colder, the shadows heavier. When he tried to sleep, he thought he heard the faintest sound of metal scraping against wood, as if the locket were moving. He told himself it was the wind, yet he couldn't shake the image of the scratched-out face. The more he stared at it, the more it felt deliberate, not an act of rage, but of protection, as though someone had tried to erase the woman not out of hate, but out of fear of being found by her again. The laughter began on a night when the forest was impossibly still. The journalist had been awake for hours, sitting by the dim light of his lantern, his notes spread across the table in disordered piles. He had been trying to piece together the fragments of the Hollow Creek lineage, the repeating names, the eyeless births, the strange carvings he'd begun finding on trees near his cabin. But his concentration broke when the wind died. The air turned dense, pressing against the windows, and the usual hum of nocturnal life fell away until only silence remained. It was in that silence, somewhere beyond the tree line, that he first heard it, a soft, lilting sound that at first seemed harmless, almost musical. Then, as it grew clearer, his skin tightened. It was laughter. It was faint, distant, and distinctly human, echoing through the woods in a rhythm that didn't belong to joy or amusement. It was slow, deliberate, and layered, as if several voices were laughing at once but not in unison. The sound rose and fell in waves, weaving through the branches, circling his cabin like something playful and cruel at the same time. He turned off his lantern, holding his breath, straining to listen. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against his eardrums. For several minutes, there was nothing. Then it came again, closer this time, softer, as if whispering directly into the dark. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the mist, catching nothing but the skeletal outlines of trees and the glimmer of dew on wet grass. Yet the sound persisted, now coming from behind him, now from beneath the ground, as though the forest itself was mocking his search. Each time he turned, the laughter shifted, always just out of reach. It wasn't until he crouched near the old creek bed that he realized it was coming from below. The earth trembled faintly, and for a moment, he swore he heard voices speaking underneath the laughter, muffled, fragmented words in a tone too low to understand. He stumbled back toward the cabin, his heartbeat pounding against the stillness. Inside, the sound faded again, leaving behind only the creak of settling wood and the soft ticking of his recorder. When he played it back minutes later, the laughter was gone, replaced by static that rose and fell in the same rhythm he had heard outside. But underneath the static, there was something else, a whisper that seemed to repeat his name, drawn out and broken, like someone trying to remember how to speak it. From that night on, he never heard the forest silence the same way again. Every pause between the rustling leaves felt like a breath being held, waiting for that laughter to return. The recording was found in a forgotten corner of the abandoned chapel, hidden beneath a loose floorboard coated with decades of dust. The journalist had returned to the crumbling structure, driven by a strange pull he couldn't quite explain. The Bible he'd found earlier still haunted him, and the words scrawled in its margins, "the eyes are closed to see the truth," echoed endlessly in his mind. When his flashlight caught the glint of metal beneath the rotting boards, he pried one up and discovered an old reel-to-reel recorder, its casing dented and covered in grime. Inside it, a brittle tape waited, labeled in shaky handwriting, "Sermon number 12, Father Abram Hollow." The name struck him immediately. Hollow Creek. Hollow. It couldn't be coincidence. He brought the recorder back to the cabin and spent the night coaxing it to life. The tape crackled as it began to spin, and the first sound that emerged was a distorted hum, followed by the deep, uneven voice of a man speaking into a distant microphone. His tone carried the weight of authority, but it trembled with something else, fear. "Brothers and sisters," the voice began, "we have walked too long in the shadow of our own making. The Lord turns his face from those who mock the order of his creation." A pause followed, long and uneven, and then a lower whisper, almost too faint to hear. "But what if the darkness was not punishment, but inheritance?" The sermon continued, its rhythm more desperate with each word. The preacher spoke of a sin that sealed the valley, of a family chosen not for salvation but for remembrance, bound by blood to carry their ancestors' wrongs. He spoke of children born knowing the darkness before the womb, whose eyes were never meant to open. Each phrase bled into the next, the words collapsing under the weight of madness and conviction. The journalist could hear faint sounds in the background, shuffling feet, quiet sobbing, the creak of wood as if people were kneeling. It was not a sermon meant for comfort but for confession. Midway through, the preacher's voice changed. It grew softer, trembling, as though he were no longer addressing a congregation but pleading with something unseen. "You've taken the eyes, but not the sight," he said. "You've closed the womb, but not the seed. They will return, even after the earth swallows them." The final moments dissolved into static, but beneath the distortion, the journalist could swear he heard another voice, not the preacher's, but something breathless and childlike, whispering a single word, "stay." When the tape clicked to a stop, the silence in the cabin was unbearable. He realized then that the sermon was not a warning delivered to the valley, it was a recording of surrender, the final prayer of a man who had already seen what was coming. The cellar was not on any of the old maps, nor mentioned in any of the documents the journalist had collected. It was discovered purely by accident, after he returned to the collapsed remains of the Hollow family home. The cabin had been reduced to a skeleton of charred beams and splintered wood, the earth around it swollen with years of rain and rot. He had walked its perimeter dozens of times, taking photographs and notes, but on that particular morning, something different caught his eye, a patch of ground that seemed unnaturally flat amid the uneven terrain. When he brushed aside the moss and debris, his hand struck the outline of a heavy wooden hatch. The hinges were rusted, fused with age, but after several minutes of struggle, it gave way with a sound that cut sharply through the silence of the woods. A cold draft rose from below, carrying with it the scent of earth and something older, something that smelled faintly of iron and damp stone. The narrow staircase descended into darkness, each step groaning beneath his weight. His flashlight beam wavered across the rough walls, revealing what looked like carved markings, crosses, circles, and symbols that meant nothing to him yet felt deliberate. When he reached the bottom, the air was dense and motionless, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly in the distance. It was there, in the thin circle of light cast by his flashlight, that he saw the walls. Every inch of them was covered in handprints, hundreds of them, pressed into the dirt and stone as though people had clawed at the walls from within. Some were small, belonging to children, while others were larger and smeared, the prints layered so thickly they almost formed a texture. The soil around them was darkened, and when he leaned closer, he realized the prints had been made not with paint, but with ash. At the far end of the cellar stood an altar-like slab of stone, cracked down the middle. On its surface lay fragments of old candles, bones of small animals, and a single wooden carving depicting a faceless figure holding what looked like an infant. The journalist's flashlight flickered as he examined it, and for a moment he thought he saw something move among the shadows, just the faintest shift, as though one of the handprints had been freshly pressed. His breath quickened. The air around him seemed to pulse, as if the cellar itself was breathing. When he finally climbed back up and pushed the hatch closed behind him, the daylight above felt foreign. The forest no longer looked still but watchful, its silence heavy with knowledge. The journalist couldn't shake the image of those prints, those desperate, reaching hands pressed into the walls, each one a message from those who had been buried in the dark, trying to find their way back to the surface. The realization came slowly, crawling into the journalist's mind like a sickness he could neither name nor fight. For days, he had told himself that everything he'd witnessed could be explained: superstition, isolation, the psychological decay of a community consumed by guilt and madness. But as he sat in the cabin surrounded by his notes, the Bible, the locket, and the recorder, all the fragments began to connect with a logic that defied the natural world. Each artifact, each voice, each sign in the woods was not merely history, it was presence. The family had not died out. Their bloodline had endured in a form that no longer belonged to the world above. The eyeless women, the silent children, the nameless laughter beneath the earth, they were not the echoes of the past. They were what remained. It began with sound. Late one night, while reviewing the recordings from his field notes, he noticed faint patterns beneath the static, breathing, then whispers. When he amplified the audio, the voices formed fragmented words, repeating the same phrase over and over, *, you came back. *, the voice was soft, high-pitched, neither fully human nor entirely distant, as if it had been recorded from within the walls of the cabin itself. The realization struck him with the cold clarity of truth. He wasn't alone. He never had been. Every step he'd taken, every night he'd spent in that place, something had been watching him, not from the shadows, but from the very earth beneath his feet. The following morning, he found footprints outside the cabin. They were small, almost delicate, leading from the forest's edge to his doorstep. At first, he thought they belonged to an animal, but the shape was unmistakably human, bare, narrow feet pressed deep into the mud. The tracks stopped right at the door, but none led away. He followed them with his eyes and saw movement in the tree-line, just a flicker, a figure too pale and still to be mistaken for a person. When he called out, the forest swallowed his voice whole. The figure didn't run. It only turned, and though it had no eyes, he felt it looking directly at him. That night, the laughter returned, closer than ever, circling the cabin until the sound felt as though it were coming from the floorboards themselves. The walls trembled softly, as if something beneath was shifting, rising. He remembered the words of the preacher's recording, the promise that they will return, even after the earth swallows them. The truth was no longer myth or metaphor. The eyeless descendants of Hollow Creek had survived, buried in the soil, breathing through the roots, listening through the ground. And now they knew his name.